Nice.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us at the iMoney Pre-Budget 2019 live discussion. I'm Iris. So let's get started. Budget 2019. It is a highly anticipated national budget for us, as it is the first budget under the new government. So there are lots of questions surrounding what will be announced, how they will deal with the national debts, and what is this SST 2.0. So with us here today, on the far right, we have Mr. Steve Chia, tax partner from PwC, Mr. Shahril Hamdan. He's a newly elected Deputy UMNO Youth Chief, and Tan Sri Ramon Navaratnam, who is well versed in macroeconomics, budget planning, and public finance. And last but not least, Mr. Ali Salman, IDEA's Chief Executive Officer. So thank you for joining us today. And now let's get started. So Budget 2019. So Prime Minister Tun Dr. Mahathir described the budget as sacrificial budget. And Finance Minister Lim Guan Eng said it will be a belt-tightening exercise. So Tan Sri Ramon, what do you think will be different in this budget compared to the last?
Well, I hope this budget, for the reasons you mentioned, because it's the first government of the new government after 60 years, that there will be a difference. Otherwise, expectations will be let down. We want to know what this new government can do, which is different. Different in the sense that the mass of people gain more than others. It's also going to be a very tight budget. I worked in the Treasury for many years, and I don't envy them in the planning of this budget. You don't know where to move. But I hope, if there's one message I leave behind, I hope they will not overreact and make the budget tighter than it has to be. Because, maybe I won't take too much time initially, but I'll explain later.
Okay. So yeah, so iMoney has been running surveys, pre-budget surveys over the years, and we've recently conducted one. But one thing always remain the top concerns among Malaysians, which is the rising cost of living. So this is what the biggest worry that keeps them up at night. So this is in conjunction with the Khazanah Research Institute study that was recently released. They found that the residual income for the lower income household is only 76 ringgit a month. That's shocking. So Shahril, what do you think of the idea of abolishing BRIM? What is the impact it will have on the people?
So I think that particular question, if we were to abolish BRIM, would be something I think is an overreaction, as Tan Sri would say, or Tan Sri mentioned. Because, going back to what you said, Iris, all indications are that this will be quite an austerity type budget. What the ministers have said, what the Prime Minister has said, what was tabled during the midterm review a couple of days back, all indicate that the government feels the need to reduce expenditure. Even the numbers that were planned for public investment throughout the rest of the 11 Malaysia plan, that will be reduced. So I imagine that will be translated in the budget next couple of days, on the 2nd of November. I find this to be quite troubling, considering that the macroeconomic situation, in my belief, and the economic ideology that I think I subscribe to might be different from what Ideas does, is that at this point is where public expenditure needs to be increased. This idea that you can reduce government expenditure, hope that private investments will go up. How are you expecting private investments to go up when you cancel contracts willy-nilly? How do you expect private consumption to also go up when you are giving mixed signals as to what you believe on cash transfer programs like BRIM, like assistance to farmers, assistance to planters? All these things have, the government has indicated its ambivalent stance to these policies. And I'm beginning to feel that finally we are about to see what the economic ideology of Pakatan Harapan is. And it seems to be a very neoliberal, belt-tightening, reduced deficit kind of administration, and not a more balanced one, which was the one that we saw last time around. But we'll see.
Okay.
If I can just jump in on this, I think important observations made here in terms of the the government overall economic policy direction. And actually, I would go a bit behind a couple of years ago, when the previous government had started, ideas had considered a good economic reforms program, which actually included cutting costs and reducing the fiscal deficit, which at some points ideas was also appreciated in terms of it is important to move towards balanced budget. So we hope that despite the fact that there are of course significant revenue gaps now after GST is no more there, but we hope that while the costs are being cut, the right kind of expenditures are being targeted to be cut. So we have for instance hundreds of GLCs. We have inefficient programs being run. We have also other examples of public expenditures which needs to be rationalized. They do not have to directly affect B40, and I hope that none of these cuts affect the B40 directly. But there are government has huge room to cut down expenditure before actually even starting on new taxes. So that's the kind of cost cutting which we would like to see.
Okay. Yeah, I think I believe that nothing too shocking should be done in this budget, because it might be people are still getting used to the new government and all that. So the same survey, we found that only 5% of the respondents actually are in favor of BRIM. Yeah, so of course we take that with a pinch of salt. Our audience, is of the middle income group and all that. So
Maybe
in your
I'll
opinion,
just add on to that.
Yes?
I think if you look at, I think I agree with Ali, is that in the sense that definitely we have the macroeconomic issues that we need to resolve, but I think the well-being of the rakyat needs to be taken care of.
Yes.
And to address cost of living is not an easy answer, and it will take time. And I think that's where financial assistance may come in at this moment. But there must be a strategy that we need to phase them out over time. It cannot be that it's always there forever, and the expectation cannot be that.
So I think the next question I have is, what else can the government do in place of BRIM if, let's say, they really do abolish BRIM? So in the short term, what can they do to help the B40 cope with the rising cost of living? Steve, would you like to take this one?
Okay, so if you were to look at it, if you look at the household income, generally the top three household income will be housing, food and beverages, as well as in relation to transportation. So some targeted financial assistance could potentially help. I think there's been talks about having a discounted monthly transport card to the B40. That could be something that the government could look at. In terms of housing, I know there's been talks for a number of years in terms of PRIMA, PP. There's lots of acronyms that is basically supporting the affordable housing. But I suppose the big question is, how effective are those initiatives at this moment? And it seems that different initiatives are geared towards different target audience. So should we see some consolidation in terms of these efforts, so that at least we can see a clearer direction in terms of the housing part of it? I think last budget, they talked about the rent-to-own scheme. I think some developers have sort of rolled that out already, but how effective is it? I don't think it has been fully sort of analyzed at this moment, but definitely I think that's a step in the right direction.
And on the BRIM itself, I'd like to just add one important point. So I think I am not saying that it needs to be abolished right away, but I think there are important reforms which can be undertaken. And we have, around the world, we have examples of, for instance, conditional cash transfers. And how these conditional cash transfers work, they actually attach the cash transfers with the conditions like learning. So the families which are receiving such cash transfers are encouraged to actually invest into their children's education or into their health. So actually this whole cash transfer becomes a sort of an incentive tool to help them invest in their own future, rather than just helping in the consumption. I think it's obviously futile to believe that BRIM is a poverty alleviation tool. It is not a poverty alleviation tool. It just helps to smoothen the consumption. But then even that kind of money can be used to actually encourage people to improve their own decision making, and that is called conditional cash transfer. And this is something which the government may consider.
I'd like to add something to what Ari said. I think we have to be very careful about scrapping something if we don't have a good alternative. Scrapping BRIM, I mean, to us middle class, upper middle, low middle class, it may not be so significant. But to the poor, it's very important. Maybe there have been some abuses. I am told some families, when they get BRIM, they go out and celebrate. You know, that's not the way to do it. But if you have some scheme, as Ali says, where you get vouchers for education, for tuition, for clothes, for essentials, that may help a great deal. But let me go back to this whole macro issue. We can't have the same old style. We will be tinkering with the system. And there's not much to tinker. How much revenue can you raise? How much expenditure can you cut? Because there is like charge expenditure, pensions, grants to state, per capita grants, you can't do anything about it. The debt got to be serviced, you can't run away from it. So what's left? Not much, you know, to maneuver. But they're going to cut on research, for example. And that has been done in the past. And that's not right. Universities suffer, our long-term structure is affected. So I would come back to this issue of what do people want? They just want less inflation. They want their basic needs, as you say, Steve, fulfilled. You can't do it all in one budget, but there must be, within the context of the midterm review and the longer-term 5-year plan, have a structure that encourages competition. I believe that a lot of the inflationary pressure comes about through too much protection, crowding out the private sector with the GLCs, who need not be that efficient, or could be much more efficient. And what is the role of GLCs? If you want to ensure balanced employment, well, you can have other means of doing it. But don't restrict the economy and get the private sector to play its proper role. Of course, you have proper rules and regulations. If they abuse it, get in. And you can tax if they do well. But to change the whole structure, I think the NEP should be reviewed, for example.
Yes.
The budget must be an instrument which brings joy and happiness, relief, and a sense of fair play
Yes.
and equity. But if people say, well, look, I'm not benefiting, others are benefiting, they will react against it. And 5-year plans and budgets will be unpopular rather than instruments for change and benefit. So I would think that the NEP should now be extended to cover income groups based on needs, as they say, and mean it. Bukan cakap sajalah. You must implement policies and monitor it and let the people be aware. And if the government doesn't deliver, the government must be told, whichever government. But the poor must be looked after. The 40% must be, bottom 40%, the middle 40% should also be cared for. Otherwise, you have brain drain, you have migration, you have capital outflow, and this is what has been happening. Thank you.
So going back to the topic, another hot topic for this new budget is SST 2.0. So our survey, the same survey that we ran, we found that 47% of the respondents actually do not care whether it's GST or SST. And then 35% are actually pro-SST. So it is, Steve, it's common knowledge that GST is a more progressive tax system. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Malaysia may be the first country that reverts from GST to SST. So what other enhancements can the government make to SST to help Malaysia cope with their living costs that will have an immediate impact?
Okay, I suppose if you look at SST, it's actually a lot more, in a way, it's a narrow tax system. So as opposed to GST, which is multi-stage and it covers almost everything. So SST being a narrow tax system, hopefully, if you look at the list of exemption for consumer goods, more than 5,000 items are being exempted. So I think that is good news to the rakyat, because if you look at it from a theoretically perspective, so I use the word theory, you should see price reductions. I suppose then the key thing is when it comes to the actual implementation of it, whether that savings, if any, is it sort of flowing down to the rakyat. And I think that's where enforcement of anti-profiteering legislations should actually come in to actually manage that. Of course, I think MDTCA, the Ministry of Domestic Trade, recently also did a study. They compared the prices between September against May. So it's trying to carve out the tax holiday period. So comparing May with GST, and 70% of the items, apparently prices have dropped.
Apparently.
Okay, yeah, 27% is actually up, and then 3% is thereabouts. So I suppose to me is that the rationale for the 70% potentially could also be due to we are still seeing the after effects of the tax holiday, because traders are still selling stocks that they have acquired during the tax holiday period. So I think a more sort of, in a way, fair assessment may come in, say, 3 to 6 months later. Then we can see once things are stabilized, then how that will actually pan out in terms of pricing. So I think it's a bit too early to really see the impact of prices due to SST.
Okay. Ali, what's your take on this?
Well, I was just thinking about the other factor, the other policy of price control, which Steve mentioned. And it's interesting. IDEA has actually published a paper last year, which look into the price control policy when it was introduced, coupling with the introduction of GST in 2015-16. And the intention was very noble, that while the GST would of course increase the cost for the business, this additional increment should not be passed on the consumer. So government actually introduced price control. But what we observe from our data of companies, especially those who are doing trading and wholesaling business, there were actually thousands of businesses which were actually forced to close down, because the simultaneous application of GST and the price control, because they could not actually absorb especially those businesses which are essentially running on high turnover, and they cannot have a high profit of in terms of percentage. So when this happens, essentially we're looking at reduced supplies, and then which actually have a negative effect of ultimately price rising. So we have to be very careful when we are trying to maneuver, thinking, government always thinking, Tansri, I don't know if you agree with that, but government thinks that they can actually control somehow these outcomes by tinkering with policies. I'm afraid, market has much bigger role in these decisions. Therefore, we have not seen the kind of price reduction which people were expecting, were told in the transition from GST to SST. We have not seen because there are so many other factors in play.
Yeah. I think that's a good
Structural.
point.
Indeed, structural.
Yeah.
We are subsidies. You mentioned about protectionism. You mentioned about freedom, and so this all affect the prices. So it just cannot be a tax.
Tax is just one small element
Yeah.
in the bigger scheme of things.
That's right. Yeah.
So I find there's one thing missing in this entire discussion about SST and GST. Two things lah. One is the surprising speed at which the entire commentariat suddenly says prices is not about taxation alone. Where was this wisdom during the time when everyone seemed to be hitting out against GST? So that's point one, which I think is a fair question to throw. Second point is there is a 20 billion or so hole in the government revenue because of this abolishment of GST. And however you spin it, Steve, I think everyone agrees that GST is a far more efficient tax system. This 22 billion or whatever billion that we are expecting from SST a year, that also I think already takes into, you're not pricing in the potential for people to run away from paying this SST, which is quite possible, far more possible than you would under GST. So on this second point, Iris, it's amazing that the government right now is asking people to belt tighten, is saying that I've got no more goodies to give out, which is what the finance minister said. Yet it didn't think twice to implement a policy it itself realizes reduces government revenue. And if one were to say this was a manifesto promise, it's also quite clear that they were quite happy to not implement a slew of other promises. Why implement this one, which clearly puts you in a more difficult situation in terms of how you manage debt and deficit, and basically transferring the burden of savings or expenditure from what the state ought to be taking to basically I've got to cut certain programs and we'll see what happens on 2nd November. But presumably if they want to maintain anything around 3% budget deficit, then some things have got to go. Whether it's BRIM being cut down, being scaled back, being reformed in such a way that less is spent, whether it's other cash assistance programs, whether it's far more seriously long-term structural R&D type programs, something's got to give. And that worries me. Unless they do an about face and suddenly say, look, we're not really worried about deficit. We're quite happy to run a big deficit because we think, it's not such a concern. But they've really snookered themselves because they keep playing up this 1 trillion debt. So in a way, I feel that government in the last 4 or 5 months, this new government, has gone around putting itself in a bind, something that it need not have done. But now that they have, I'm just quite worried which part of the whole pie it's going to give.
Actually, the second point is what I'm about to bring up, the shortfall. Tan Sri Ramon, what do you think, what are the steps that the government can take to address this shortfall in the short term?
I'm taking up the point what Shahril has mentioned. We can ignore elephants in the room. But the point is, the budget and economic policy has become, over the years, increasingly politicized. The GST, to my mind, need not have been scrapped. Could have been modified. And more preference given to protect the poor. You can exempt a whole lot of items that are basic needs. But it was a popular thing to say because nobody likes taxes. So if you said, we're going to scrap all taxes, you might have got a bigger vote. But that's not the way to do things. So now they have to make some adjustments. The same argument I have, politicization of economic policy, of course stems from the NEP, but is carried on now on the question of deficit. To me, whether it's 2.8 or 3% or 3.2 or 3.3, is not a big, it's not a science, It's a question of judgment. And very often in economic management, you just take options, decisions, and adjust as you go along. So there's nothing sacrosanct about 3%. All right, it goes up from 2.8 to 3%. Fine. If it goes a bit more, fine. We'll see how it goes, how the economy responds, how the prices respond. The other one is the debt. I agree, 1 trillion is large. But it is within our capacity to finance. Because by whatever definition, and there are 2-3 definitions for it, take the most or the widest definition, it's still some 65-70% of the GDP, and you can live with it. A lot of countries have far higher ratios and still do very well, better than us do. So I think we have to reduce the politicization of our economic thinking, policy, planning and implementation. Otherwise, we will shock India and say everything is fine. you find the countries around us, they are moving ahead and we will lose out. So we got to think of it long term. The budgets are annual budgets, but they are supposed to reflect the aspirations of 5-year plans and long-term 20-year plans. But when that's not done, when it's done when they're designed, and I hope it's not, with the next election in mind, then there's a real problem. Then we will become like many other countries that have been failing. We have done well because I think to a large extent our fiscal, financial, economic policies were quite professionally done. There might have been some lapses which we didn't anticipate, which we could have corrected and we can still correct. But by and large, we've been on the right track. So let's carry on in that mode. Otherwise, we are in trouble.
But addressing now that the government is in this, like what Shahril say, is in a bind. So how can they actually make up for this shortfall?
Well,
Ivan?
actually, as I think, first of all, I agree with Tansri about the 1 trillion that number, and ideas has been on record. And by the way, we also were on record on GST that we actually were comparing even before elections, and we said I think GST is a better option, and we published some articles on that. So we were definitely trying to address the issues on the merit. On the fiscal deficit, on the debt crisis, our view is that the real metric, as Tansri also hinted, is not actually even the stock of the debt. It actually how much debt repayment you have to make every year. Last year in our budget, about 10 to 11% was kept for debt repayment. And the international benchmark for the debt sustainability is 30%. So Malaysia is well within the safe limits of the debt sustainability. And we think that this discussion and this headline of 1 trillion is misleading. It should not drive our budgetary decisions, definitely. But on the question of the budgetary cuts, as I said, the government has several options to cut down. And to appreciate what they have started already is to identify the projects, the large infrastructure projects, which were now we understand, they were cost overruns, they lacked transparency, and I think that kind of transparency which the government has started showing is admirable. That will in the short run already, that will actually cut down the expenditure, that will cut down the kind of money which government has to keep in running those projects. So that is one big area. Cut down, drastically review the projects. And the other is, as I said, how much money government is pumping each year, GLCs. It needs more review. It's not going to be easy. So I'm not sure if the government is ready to take up that area so far. There's no indication. The government should set up at least a committee to set up to review to reforms the GLCs. Nothing on that front so far. And some of these areas can help in actually in reducing this sort of the gap, the fiscal deficit.
I think talking about the gap, I think the other area that people have been talking about is, would there be new taxes
Correct.
coming into
on the revenue side?
On the revenue side, so we talk about costs. So
Right.
would there be new
Sure.
taxes? But again, we are removing GST with SST with the view that we are going to cut taxes. So I suppose I think getting things like inheritance tax, capital gains tax, soda tax, increasing of sin tax, I think has been the talk of the town, I think, for the last couple of weeks. I think the important thing is that, as you rightly say, if the 1 trillion issue is something that can be addressed, we should not take drastic measures. And all these new taxes needs to be looked at on a holistic manner. Like, for example, inheritance tax, how efficient is that? How much revenue are we going to collect from inheritance tax? Actually, MOF, I think, did a presentation in Japan in 2015 in an IMF conference. And the estimation is only less than 70 million a year. So is it an efficient new tax that's going to be implemented? So I think hopefully we don't take drastic measures, but potentially on the medium-term basis, some of these new taxes may be rolled in to create a more sustainable revenue stream.
So
And
yeah.
even if inheritance tax were to draw 10 times this amount you mentioned, I would think that is essentially an immoral idea.
I don't.
Because you are paying taxes throughout your life, and now the government is going to tax you after your death.
By that measure, you should never have any consumption tax because you already have income tax.
Well, that also kind of is an interesting point. Yeah,
That's a
why
different
not?
discussion.
Why not? I would say.
I would like to support the view that you need to tax. Those who can't pay, let them pay.
This
I'm not
inheritance tax I
saying
was
the
mentioning.
middle income, the low income, you exempt them. But why do people accumulate billions? For whom? They can't take 1 cent out. Let them, encourage them to have foundations.
Yeah.
Like I don't know, Sunway, if I may say, a billion worth of assets to back up a foundation. 400 million given out every year in scholarships. Lift the burden, take the burden off government. You can do it for health, education, transport, anything.
It's a good point.
The school system, encourage more international schools if you like. But those who feel, look, they want better quality education with better teacher-pupil ratio, fine. But government schools increase their quality. How can we go forward when our PISA rates, the analysis of our education quality are so low? How can we build up good universities? As I said, remove the politics. Vice chancellors have been, for a long time, been appointed on the basis of their political affiliation. That's not the way to run the education system. So we can do a lot of this. And on the tax side, estate duty, property gains tax, of course, don't make it punitive. But above a certain level, tax them. Otherwise, we'll be having the cake and eating it, and that doesn't work anywhere. And if you have to borrow more, borrow a little bit more, because we haven't hit the threshold. So the sense is, you asked, where do you adjust? Go for a consolidation of the budget. A little bit of revenue, cut back a little expenditure in the areas where you can, because there's a lot of wastage. And if they go all out on corruption, I think they can save a lot. The civil service can be improved. 1.6 million civil servants. It's not easy to sack them. They guarantee their employment in many ways, unless they are criminal. And so how do you do it? So improve the standards and efficiency and the quality. Make it more multiracial. That's why I say there are too many elephants in the room. If we ignore it, then we are not solving the problem. We are not helping government solve the problem. We are not getting the people to realize what can and should be done to solve the problem. We will be tinkering with the system, and that's not going to help.
If I can just add, I'm going to use two words I don't particularly like. One is game changer, and the other one is paradigm shift. Overused terms. But I think on to all the points that all the other panelists have mentioned about not tinkering with the system, not limiting ourselves to simply tinkering at the margins, but also trying to do something bold. There's a unique opportunity here because a couple of reasons. It's a new government, first time after 60 years. Expectations, while high on some parts, in some ways there's a blank sheet for this government. It has bound itself through its statements a bit here and there, but nothing that I think it can't unentangle itself from. I'm hoping to see, as a Malaysian, some bold reforms around how we look at the economy. Something that I'd like to say the previous government had started, a bit late, but started. Stuff around TN50, stuff around future-proofing the economy, stuff around how do we look at reducing the civil service in time, not the current batch, but in time. All these things, all this R&D stuff and innovative ideas that you put in place in successive years but only see the results later on. I'm hoping this administration does this and not reverts to a 1980s, 1990s style, which was very limited and narrow in focus. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that they don't bind themselves to this, man-made deficit target. I hope that they don't play up this 1 trillion debt, to the high heavens. They might do it for political reasons, but when it comes to budgetary considerations, I hope they, they become professionals about it. I really hope that they are bold in figuring out what the scope of the possibilities are. We have been in this, I won't say a rut, but we've been in this paradigm where it's always been about let's manage the deficit, let's not make sure the debt doesn't go, let's make sure the debt doesn't go out of control. Let's invest here and there in sexy R&D, innovative ideas just to showcase in the Star the next day. I'm thinking let's use the opportunity that is present here and make some bold bets. So let's say if say over time the government says I'm going to invest in these 3 industries, and I say these 3 industries are going to be game changers for the Malaysian economy. I'm going to invest a lot on making sure that the women participation in the labour force is high. And I'm going to do these 3 crazy, bold reforms, right? You put your bets on certain things, say 5 to 10 things, over the next couple of years within this term. Then I think the Malaysian public will see, hey, it's not just 2 different parties who seem to speak in the same kind of language. I think the 1990s, early 2000s in the West especially, have seen that the right of centre and left of centre kind of governments or parties are very, very similar. In Malaysia, we don't have that baggage, and I don't think we need to have that baggage. So I'm hoping that over time, over the next couple of years, we start to see different economic ideologies being debated in the public sphere. The ideas type of high private sector involvement, market runs everything, low public investment or low public state interventions. And then another side saying, no, we think that it's time for a more aggressive state interventions on certain things, and we forget the idea that market can solve every problem. Malaysia has never had this kind of debate, and I'm quite hopeful that with the moment that we have, in the next couple of years, there will be this kind of debates and contestations, which will hopefully lead to a better kind of economic thinking in this country.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What you say is very hopeful, and I hope you're right. But you are in politics.
Yes, I am.
How come these issues are not raised earlier? For the last 60 years, suddenly we say they should do it.
No, what I'm
Why
saying,
do-
Tan Sri.
So I'm just saying, genuinely, there must have been problems. I'm asking you as a political potential leader, what are the constraints to change, especially from the ground, grassroots? And will they still be there, and how do you counter it?
It's a very good question. I think there will be a lot of pushback because we've only done things one way this past 30 years, I would argue. We have depended a lot on this GLC kind of model. We've depended a lot on a large civil service. We've depended a lot on investment vehicles that the state runs. And there are a whole slew of ancillary kind of economic activity that goes around that animal, if you like, that entity. And what I'm saying is, you can say, why didn't BN do this before? Why weren't there voices within BN to push for it? One, there were voices, even if it wasn't publicized. Two is, now Pakatan's got this opportunity to do it.
Right.
It does not have that baggage. It doesn't have expectations that were promised or whatever to this legacy kind of commitments. So I think just like in non-economic issues, social reforms and what have you, they have an opportunity that BN progressive guys never had. On economic issues too, there are bold steps for reforms, whether it's more towards a market-oriented reform or a different kind of almost new left kind of economic reform. We'll see, but they have the chance to do it rather than staying on in this hodgepodge centrist, a bit of BRIM, but also market, a bit of vouchers here and there, but still state intervention. I
But
think
you anticipate a backlash still.
Definitely, but that's
How strong will it be?
it
Otherwise,
will.
we can't move.
Well, Tan Sri, the thing that Pakatan has right now is immense political capital, which I don't think the recent previous BN administrations had. So what I'm saying is, if you don't seize this moment, then we'll be stuck when this century's passed to, what I mean by centrist is, in this particular case, almost like a hodgepodge mixed bag of everything with no clear economic ideology.
So they must seize the opportunity.
I would
strike while the iron is hot.
Yes, but if they strike
the
the wrong way, I
message.
will be the first to speak up.
Of course. That's
But I
why
think
want
what
you
we
there.
can gather from Shahril and Tan Sri Ramon is we have to future-proof the country, and budget is one platform that we can do it, and it has to be long-term. So one of the the first thought that we all have is in the expenditure in education. So we have been steadily increasing the expenditure in education over the years. And then, but the recent KRI study actually shows that we have 3.1 years of idle education. So is it safe to say that we are not spending the right places? And if so, which are the areas that we should be spending on in education? Shahril, would you like to take this?
I wouldn't say we're not spending enough in education. It's always the biggest, chunk of the budget. Whether we spend in the right areas, there's always improvements. So I think, in my mind, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, my sense is you do the hygiene level stuff. You do the stuff you have to do to improve the basic level of education. And that means basic infrastructure concerns that still exist in many schools in rural areas and remote areas. So you do all of that stuff. You do the basic level of ensuring there's enough teacher supply, yada yada yada. That's that's dry, boring stuff. You do that, but you place certain bets on how do you ensure a couple of clusters or a couple of schools really become champions. A couple of models really become champions. Now there have been previous ideas, sekolah wawasan, all these kind of things. We've spoken about it before, but I think that there hasn't been the requisite political will to push it through. And this relates also to, say, university. In the last budget, if I'm not mistaken, there was a push to make UM the top 100 universities.
Yeah.
So there will always be the voices that say, no, look, the old socialist kind of voice, which says, no, it's not fair, we put more resource to one university, everyone's got to rise up together, right? So my sense is, no, do different. Ensure that you ring fence a certain amount of expenditure for building champions, and that means champion universities, champion school models, which become a kind of model for how a future education policy might be, rather than getting stuck in this conundrum whereby Malaysia, being what it is, will always be diversified, will always be fragmented, will always have unequal developmental growth levels. So for every sekolah Bukit Damansara, you will have something in Sabah and Sarawak, in the rural areas of Kedah and Kelantan, which need different kind of assistance. And rather than make everyone happy, because that's always been our policy, Tan Sri, it's always been, let's make everyone happy. And what does that mean?
Everybody unhappy.
When you try to make everyone happy, it's suboptimal. You've got to do the hygiene stuff, but also be bold enough to say, no, look, I'm going to bet and invest big on certain areas, even if it means, it looks as if I'm neglecting or, not putting the same kind of priority on other areas. You've got to make those bold steps. Otherwise, like Tan Sri said, other countries are catching up. This is not the 80s and 90s anymore, where you can just, boom, input everywhere and then output will go up. I don't think we're in that level anymore. We've got to be bold and making, risky kind of policy decisions, which again, Pakatan has the best political capital in recent memory to do it.
On a lighter note, let me suggest that I think the government should appoint Shahril as advisor at large.
You probably disagree on most things, Ali.
So
On the targeted areas, I think one area is that is on TVET. I think we've been talking about TVET for some time, but I don't think there's concerted efforts where we really make it to be a big bet to actually move that forward. Because Malaysian parents, we want our kids to actually have degree, but whether that degree is a third-class degree, it doesn't matter. As long as it's a degree that give them a white-collar job, that's what we want. But actually, there's lots of potential in TVET, and the education, even at the parents' level, is critical. If my kids wants to do a TVET type of studies, that's fine. Because if you look at countries like Germany, Japan, they all grew at the back of a strong TVET education. So I think that is, to me, it's a big missing link that I think for a number of years we have never tried to address it.
Can I add to what Shahril and Steve said? And your lighter note too. But the quantum, one can argue, give another billion or whatever, give or take. It's largely about 25% of the budget, education. But it's the quality. The quality of our teachers, and I'm going to continue to be honest about it. Why are the vast majority of teachers of one racial group? By having that constraint in the civil service too, you pay a price. Politically you gain, but efficiency-wise, national progress-wise, you lose out. You know the Finnish, they not finished their job. The experts from Finland. What's the simple truth? Their teachers are about the best paid of all the professions. A lot of the best brains go into teaching, not at the university level alone, right from the bottom. Quality. 2, they ensure that they have systems which encourage children to learn. In the world of the digital economy, what are they going and learning by rote? Why are they just being repetitive in their classes? They don't even go out of the class. So all these systems must change. And for that reason, it's not the quantum, it's the quality. It must be a competitive profession. People must compete to go in. The best must be rewarded within the profession. I think they're slowly trying to do something in the last few years. But, we got, time is not on our side. Others are moving so fast. In the end, it's globalization. You either have it or don't have it, work at it and go through with bold measures, you say, or almost say, look, I want a mediocratic society, not a meritocratic society. And that's a big difference between Malaysia, who's got all the potential to beat our neighbors. But because we don't follow the right policies and are not able politically to make the right decisions, you have to lead. You got to make unpopular decisions. I mean, my parents, your parents, were strict with you. If they said, you do, lepak lah, pergi mana-mana pun, tak usah balik rumah pun boleh. If you do that, you don't get good quality. All of us, I'm sure, had strict parents. Thank God for them. Thank you.
Yeah. So like what Steve and Tan Sri Ramon say is about the quality, not the quantity. So a lot of parents push their children to have degree, but what they do with the degree is really up to them. We all like to bash millennials, their attitude, all this. We have heard a lot about it. But the truth is, youth unemployment in Malaysia has hit record high last year. So Shahril, what do you think is the real problem here? Is it really communication skills? Is it mismatched skills? What is the reason that these youth are not being employed?
A couple of things. I think all the things you mentioned. One is on the youth themselves, on the job seekers themselves. I think the comm skills, the soft skills are the ones that the most found wanting. Anecdotally, we have so many examples where candidates will come in for job interviews and have a perfect CGPA score, but can't speak to save their lives in either language. Yeah? So it could be, you ask them to speak whether in Malay or in English. They can't seem to have the confidence. And it's not just the speaking confidence, it's also the little things you ought to be doing before you go and look for jobs. Things like learning a few things about who's going to interview you, learning a few things about the prospective employer. So these kind of discipline and soft skills, for some reason, are not inculcated within the school system or university system. So that's something we ought to look at. But that's on the job seeker side. I'm less. I think it's more important to look at the almost on the demand side, your structure of the economy itself, whether there's a mismatch in what is being sought for and what is being supplied. I think there is. Steve mentioned about TVET being a big push, a big driver. If you see RMK11, most of the jobs are actually going to come from TVET qualified requirements. But our culture still seems to put a premium and put a priority on your normal university degree type route. So I feel that it is far more important now that industry get involved in curriculum, industry get involved in prepping students while they're still in their tertiary education, whether it's TVET institutions or universities. That seems to be best practices everywhere. That seems to be how you make a world-class TVET system work, where from the get-go, industry is involved. not just industry come in for your 3-month industry training or internship. That's old style 20th century way of looking at things. 21st century, industry is going to be involved in both the teaching of it, the content of it, and the experience of being a student, at least in the tertiary level. So that'd be one big reform push. That means, for example, you making certain teaching professions angry. Why are we getting professors, why are we getting CEOs and managers who come teach instead of me? I'm the lecturer, I'm the one who studied, or I'm the one who's qualified. So these are the kind of little micro examples of bold measures that will annoy certain stakeholders, but may be the right thing to do.
Actually, I think we all will agree with what Shahril is saying. But I still don't know. I must be damn naive. Sorry. Why, when it's so basic, fundamental and common sense, our political leaders have not exercised themselves in the right way and let us all down? Why? There must be some good studies undertaken by ideas or ASLI or whoever to be able to ask what motivates politicians to be able, good, dedicated, committed, and to think long term and not politically.
Because you got elections every 5 years and 3.
Yeah, but then we like India 60 years. How is there something wrong with our thinking or our culture? So what is it? I don't know. Whether you think it's a worthy question to address, because it affects the whole system.
Yeah, I think everybody just likes to be popular in their decisions. So we are running short of time. So let me just ask these questions. Usually in this forum, people will ask you what you expect from the upcoming budget. But let's switch things around. I would like to ask, what do you think should not be in this budget? Let's start with Steve.
Okay, so let me cover the tax aspects of it.
Okay.
So I don't think corporate tax rate will change, whilst I like to see, but hopefully in the medium term, we can see some reduction because at 24%, we are nowhere competitive compared to our peers. Even the European countries are moving down towards the low 20s, and we're still at the mid of 20s or 24. Individual taxes, again, I think in this environment, there may not be a lot of things that's going to happen. Unfortunately, whilst I hope that there will be more tax reliefs, but what I would hope to see is more in terms of the structural changes. If you look at the income bands that is being taxed, we have 10 bands. Do we really need 10 bands? It makes the whole administration a lot more complex. In relation to the reliefs, we actually have 17 types of reliefs, and for us to choose from to actually claim. Most countries is in less than 10. So can we rationalize that? And that will actually help with the compliance process. Hopefully, I don't see entirely new taxes, like inheritance tax, capital gains tax, but I think on that front, hopefully the government will actually take a more longer-term perspective, do a proper study before rolling out anything that will be beneficial on the longer term. Hopefully, in relation to the administration perspective, I think post-budget, we see RRB to be a lot more friendlier now. So hopefully that sentiments continue and will not change.
Okay. Shahril, how about you?
What I don't wish to see.
Yes.
I'm going to put BN hat on now. I hope there will be the minimal amount of political sniping and a complete and sincere focus on the long-term growth and prospects of the country. That's what I hope will happen. If I can just add, really hope to see, of course, all the bold stuff that I've mentioned just now. I really hope to see a different way of looking at the budget in terms of really focusing the language that's used in all this parliamentary. Because whenever the Minister of Finance / Prime Minister speak about budget, it tends to be very long-winded and based on themes. I'd really like to see a different way of presenting the budget in terms of having one area that's focused on long-term growth. Meaning the MOF minister or PM, whoever comments on this, says, let's speak one section on the next 12 years, the next 12 months. let's reserve one area of the speech and of the document to all the expenses and all the investments that are done that will not see results in the first 12 months, but is a long-term play. So at least when the public reads it, when we read it, we know, okay, so every year now, we'll always look at one section where it's focused on long-term growth. So I like to see that being done, because usually all this long-term stuff is just peppered around the document according to themes, and it gets lost in the whole jungle of words. So, yeah, that's one of the specific things I like to see.
How about you, Tan Sri
To
Ramon?
answer your question, you said, what is that we don't want to see in the
Yes.
budget? Honestly, I'm concerned that the mood is building up of a crisis budget, of a crisis economy. We all this time said the fundamentals are strong. The World Bank, IMF, rating agencies all say that. There's nobody has said that our fundamentals are weak and we're going down the drain. If we don't make corrective action, we will. But as of now, we're okay. So don't overreact. Take a little, consolidate. That's the theme. So get a bit of revenue. I would disagree with Steve. I think we can start going for the very rich. I mean, the filthy rich are filthy rich. Takes away some of it. You can make that adjustments. On the expenditure side, be cautious. There are limitations, but go for efficiency. You can get more value out of the expenditure. If you are more strict, for example, in the civil service, for example, in public finance and tenders and contracts, all the leakages that we talked about, arrest them. You can get a lot of saving. And on borrowing, provided it's domestic borrowing, if you have to raise a bit, raise a bit. But don't go into panic mood and then cut here, there and all that, and then find that very soon you've got to make adjustments because the economy will be hurt.
Sure.
Thank you.
How about Ali?
Yeah, I think a lot has been said, but I would like to add 2 points which I hope not to see in the budget. So first of all, I do not like to see financing of a third national car from the budget. Right?
Okay.
And it could come from anywhere. It could come from private capital. That's welcome. But at least government, public funds must not be committed to any such like large-scale projects which may not be driven by the private sector motive. Right? And secondly, I don't hope to see general blanket subsidies. As I said earlier, I'm in favor of targeted conditional cash transfer, but I think the blanket and general subsidies actually help those who do not deserve that more than those who actually deserve that. So these are 2 points which I definitely hope not to see.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for the insightful forum, and thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Happy Budget Day.